how did the Soviet Union really work? How were things done inside the Kremlin? In the previous video, we talked about elections in the early Soviet Union and how they were used to form the government. But now let's explore what that government actually did once formed. This will serve as a general overview of Soviet governmental structure and principles overall, though again we'll be focusing on the Lenin era for now. So let's go inside Lenin's government. But first, what were the theoretical ideas underpinning the Soviet governmental structure? Going back before the revolution, what was to become the Soviet system was conceived in a time of disenchantment over the inefficiencies and compromises of parliamentarism, meaning the system of liberal representative democracy that characterized much of Europe. In Russia specifically, the country had a limited parliament, or Duma, but it was a highly ineffectual and controlled system, a mockery of the idea of popular representation, Lenin once called it. Though even in a well-functioning liberal democracy, it was argued, such a system at best still decentered the public from their governance, by relegating participation to merely the periodic election of detached representatives. And much more importantly for the Marxists, a parliament was not a neutral arbiter above social relations either, but an abstraction from those very same social relations. A parliament could not but fall short of the hegemony of the ruling class, who ultimately produced and shaped it for the oppression of other classes. With this in mind, I'd argue there's two key works for succinctly understanding Lenin's concept for a revolutionary government. One well known, the other not so much. The first is State and Revolution, written before October, and serving as a kind of theoretical baseline going forward. Here he made clear the bourgeois political formation was constructed and oriented toward the capitalist mode of production, and thus necessarily had to be smashed and replaced by a system appropriate for a new mode of production. The revolution was both a transfer of power from one class to another, and a transfer from one type of power to another. And what would this new type look like? Drawing on Marx before him, Lenin looked to the Paris Commune as the prototype for an alternative model, the key points being the following. The way out of parliamentarism is not, of course, the abolition of representative institutions and the elective principle, but the conversion of the representative institutions from talking shops into working bodies. Quoting Marx, the Commune was to be a working, not a parliamentary body. Executive and legislative at the same time. Parliamentarians themselves have to work, have to execute their own laws, have themselves to test the results achieved in reality, and to account directly to their constituents. Representative institutions remain, but there is no parliamentarianism here as a special system, as the division of labor between the legislative and the executive, as a privileged position for the deputies. In other words, a conventional parliament established separation between rulers and ruled. It separated powers into different branches, which, while conceived as a method of mutual accountability, diluted the possibility for democratic control over any given state function. Lenin's proposal was to consolidate government, to combine legislative, executive, and judicial powers, and ultimately blur the line between state and society by means of direct public participation. Last time, we briefly mentioned the concept of democracy of the majority, and this expansion of the public sphere was another key component of that. Democracy for the majority not only meant that vastly more people were empowered than before, but that the realm of empowerment itself was richer. As in, this polity would allow people to be engaged beyond just the periodic selecting of a representative. They would, in addition, be in greater control over the political, economic, and general pursuits of everyday life. The proletarian government might resemble a parliament, might do parliamentary-style functions as well, but the whole point, however, is that this sort of parliament will not be a parliament in the sense of a bourgeois parliamentary institution. It will, of course, establish the working regulations and supervise the management of the apparatus, but this apparatus will not be bureaucratic. The workers, after winning political power, will smash the old bureaucratic apparatus, shatter it to its very foundations, and raze it to the ground. They will replace it by a new one, consisting of the very same workers and other employees, against whose transformation into bureaucrats, the measures will at once be taken which were specified in detail by Marx and Engels. In other words, the Soviet state would avoid alienation between people, politics, and the administrative bureaucracy by consolidating each role into one, by allowing every member of society to fulfill the tasks of running the state. While never actually said explicitly in State and Revolution, there's a famous paraphrase of this, that any worker, whether a housekeeper or cook, could and should administer the state. Lenin argued this was achievable because such a polity would seemingly require the least amount of state machinery of any state thus far, having done away with the expense of officialdom, but also as a result of the technological advancement of capitalism making administration as simplified as ever. And more concretely, the state would introduce principles to prevent these workers from simply transforming into the bureaucrats they replaced, namely election and rotation of every office, instant recall, and salary set to worker wages, to gradually eliminate careerism. So in sum, Lenin pictured a one-branch, single-unit government, a body that both made and executed the laws, that was both legislator and bureaucrat. Quite a few observations could be raised here, but one thing I'll note for now is that within this system, there's seemingly no conceptual space for parliamentary opposition. Theoretically, it's not possible for a representative to bear no responsibility for the legislation which his or her constituency disagrees with, because they must carry out said legislation themselves. Implicit in this is that the people have a relatively unitary set of interests, with very limited degree of conflict. Class is treated as the fundamental source of political conflict. Only they have irreconcilable interests. This is essentially a concept which Jean-Jacques Rousseau dubbed the general will, but rather than society-wide, it's assumed that each class, due to its common material interests, has a kind of general will of its own. As the Bolshevik and leading legal scholar Grigory Gorovich put it, the Soviet Republic is a common cause. State administration and the USSR are a common cause. The capitalist state wanted to adopt, or rather pretended to want to adopt, the general will of the people, i.e. something that does not exist. The Soviets will set themselves a more modest task. They have in mind not the whole people, a vague, indefinite, and motley mass, but the ruling class, the proletariat, and the propertyless peasantry, and nothing more. But here, there is a common unified will, because there is a single common interest. Thus, there isn't much consideration for conflict within the proletariat, or if there is conflict, it's because of personal deviancy, like careerism, which is really the only issue which Lenin preempts in length here. But if there are differences of opinion, which cannot be reduced to just class, if there are issues of dispute, confusion, or misperceptions, the institutional space for discussing these issues on equal footing is severely lacking. There was but one correct proletarian will, and it was the party, as the most class-conscious among them, that decoded it. The realm of debate being over misinterpretation of the general will, not over the right to determine it in the first place. So as for the design of the Soviet government, it's clear it wasn't intended to conform to typical governmental structure, and we shouldn't try to rigidly force it into the same labels of a so-called bourgeois democracy. For example, a very common error is describing this system in terms of legislative, executive, and judicial branches. On the contrary, the Soviet system was specifically set up to deny the concept of separate branches, and understanding that is the first key to understanding the system as a whole. In general, though, we can speak of two legs to the system. The Soviet hierarchy, the series of councils electing councils we talked about last time, contain the supreme organs of legislative, executive, and administrative power of the USSR. But in order to fulfill this task, it derived podsobny, or ancillary organs, which also had simultaneous legislative, executive, and administrative powers. Put simply, multiple bodies at once had the ability to pass laws, interpret them, and execute them, rather than there being a strict separation between, say, a parliament that passes laws and a cabinet that executes them. Or as Gorovich put it, The Constitution does not at all distinguish legislative organs from executive ones. It only communicates to different bodies a different volume of legislative and executive power. Chiefly, the Soviet hierarchy was represented by the Central Executive Committee, or CEC, and the most important of the ancillary organs was the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom. As a second principle, each body was formally designed to be collegial, meaning rather than being governed by a single head, any given body was de jure governed by a small council of multiple people. Not only was collegiality considered a revolutionary, transformative principle in its own right, creating a new type of state as described in State and Revolution, practically speaking, it was a way of expanding decision-making by allowing the Bolsheviks to give non-party specialists and representatives elected from below a seat at the table. This also means there technically wasn't any single president or prime minister of the Soviet Union, although in practice, each of these councils ended up being directed by a chairperson who became a kind of first among equals. So the chair of the CEC was essentially a president, in the sense of the person who presides over the assembly, and the chair of Sovnarkom was essentially a premier, though at the time these titles were only colloquial. As a third key principle, the Soviet Union was a one-party state under the Communist Party, a kind of order of swordsmen, to quote Stalin. The way this was eventually codified was that the Soviets were to be the representative body of the proletariat, while the party was their political vanguard, and thus the task of the party was to establish absolute control over decision-making on political issues in the Soviets. Or as Lenin put it, no important political or organizational issue is decided by any state institution in our republic without the guidance of the Central Committee of the party. And to accomplish this, members were subject to party discipline and were expected to unconditionally submit to decisions, carrying them out in the Soviets or elsewhere. So there were state structures and offices, as outlined in the Constitution and such, but then in parallel, there was the party and party offices, with the latter coordinating the former. Thus, it's insufficient to consider just the state apparatus and not the party, or how the two interacted. As Zinoviev once put it, "It is well known, it is no secret to anyone, that the actual leader of Soviet power in Russia is the Central Committee of the party." But let's back up for a moment and talk about where this arrangement came from. One thing to consider is that the Bolsheviks initially inherited a certain state structure, which wasn't necessarily how they might have wanted it if developed from scratch. A state structure that developed ad hoc and through improvisation out of the revolutionary situation and pre-revolutionary setups prior. As such, there was a brief period before the adoption of the first constitution where the CEC did act as a kind of multi-party quasi-parliament, and Sovnarkom, filling the vacancy left by the earlier provisional governments, appeared an executive organ, despite Lenin's protestations. But in time, the CEC lost its relevance for a number of reasons. First, Lenin and co. actively pushed for its legislative deprioritization. As you may recall from the election series, Sovnarkom was phrased as a kind of provisional quick response Bolshevik governing council, in contrast to the still mixed-party larger CEC, and so fought for and achieved the right to make laws on its own, without CEC approval if needed. Theoretically, Sovnarkom was supposed to be accountable to the CEC, and it was an open question in the first year or so what exactly that would mean. But in practice, no law was ever introduced to limit Sovnarkom. Instead, it established primacy over the CEC. First, a few days after the October Revolution, Sovnarkom declared that it would draft and issue laws unilaterally, though acknowledging the CEC had the right to suspend, amend, or revoke them. 6 days later, when objections were raised, the Bolshevik fraction within the CEC narrowly passed a law stating, "The Soviet Parliament cannot deny the Council of People's Commissars the right to issue urgent decrees without prior discussion by the Central Executive Committee, within the framework of the general program of the All-Russian Congress of Soviets." Interestingly, this law also confirmed one of the key points from State and Revolution. The Soviet Parliament of the working masses cannot have anything in common in its methods with a bourgeois parliament, where different classes with opposing interests are represented. At this early stage, the CEC was still being called a parliament, but it was made clear it was not to act as a parliament in the traditional sense. Next, as part of the negotiations to entice the left SRs into coalition, a further ordinance was passed, which reaffirmed that Sovnarkom was formally responsible to the CEC and ought to submit its acts for consideration, but it did not state how and when this had to be done, nor that laws couldn't go into effect before the CEC considered them, meaning in practice, the working relationship was such that Sovnarkom passed laws whenever it so desired, and if or when the CEC objected to a law, then it might be brought before them. So in the end, only 68 out of 480 laws passed in the first year of Bolshevik rule were actually ever submitted to the CEC, leading the architect of the law, Sverdlov, to later admit any kind of subordination of Sovnarkom or separation of powers was more of a legal fiction. Subsequent constitutional amendments curtailed the CEC into a sessional rather than permanent body, while affirming that Sovnarkom could carry out decisions requiring immediate execution. It was further added, in a resolution written by Lenin, that they may circumvent the law if and when it was necessary in the fight against counter-revolution. All this to say, by mid-1918 and on, Sovnarkom had legislatively trumped the CEC. As a second reason for its decline, the crises of the Civil War near completely hampered CEC meetings, and in any case paused any talk of reconsideration, meaning by the time the war was over, it was essentially too late to revive the separation of powers without a conscious effort. Factoring into this was its size. It had been designed as a smaller governing committee between elections of the Congresses, but the CEC became larger and elections became rarer. In particular, upon the integration of the peasant Soviets, the CEC tripled, after which it was unable to meet as frequently, which was arguably by design. Full meetings were supposed to have a 50% quorum, though it sometimes met without a quorum. There was also a legal provision allowing narrow meetings, a special type which required only a 25% quorum. But as time progressed, even 25% was harder to arrange, so the body was hardly ever called. And lastly, the CEC, and all government bodies for that matter, soon became more or less single party, making it less consequential. As in, if the Bolsheviks fully control both Sovnarkom and the CEC, and both can pass laws, you might as well do it in Sovnarkom. Although initially it wasn't unheard of for the Bolsheviks to be divided in the CEC, the removal of formal opposition, increasingly refined selection of deputies, and greater demand of, and techniques and procedures for, enforcement of party discipline, meant not only was the CEC single party, that single party began to vote unanimously. In 1921, this was affirmed by a ban on intra-party factions at threat of expulsion from the party, meaning they could not but vote unanimously in most if not all situations. And arguably, this lack of contestation diminished dynamism and activity in the body in general. In terms of government activity, the 4-month period of Bolshevik Left SR coalition would go down as one of the most fruitful of the Lenin era, even in spite of the developing crises of 1918. In practice, the two parties represented different interests and priorities, or on the theoretical level, different class pillars of the Soviet state, so they brought different ideas to the table, meaning just the presence of this other party seems to have had a kind of synergistic effect of making the government more collaborative and productive as a whole. Traditionally, Soviet historiography has emphasized in hindsight the inability of the left SRs to affect the course of events overall. But another side to this story is that the left SRs had a consistent, subtle influence on the direction of Soviet policy, in moderating and developing its implementation, and on the functionality of Soviet government itself, in making the government more structured, businesslike, and active. And so with the collapse of the left SRs, which more or less marked the end of significant party pluralism, the CEC further lost its relevance. Hence, when the first Soviet constitution came around, which aptly was approved as the left SR's uprising was being crushed, the Leninist non-separation of powers was affirmed system-wide. So now how exactly was this system laid out? Again, the theoretical center of the system was the concentric series of councils, elected bottom to top, or more specifically, each level sent delegates to a meeting, and this approved the council at that level. Though the administrative divisions and terms changed over time, there were usually around 4 levels, and each level had some kind of executive committee, possibly chaired by a collective presidium, which created various governmental departments or commissariats, in imitation of the union-wide governmental structure. Under the concept of dual subordination, these bodies were then accountable both horizontally to the body which created them, and vertically to the bodies above them. Something we touched on last time is that the elections to these bodies were based on a prearranged list, known as the Projekt Sastava, or Spisak, more specifically a list made by the party leaders of the same level, who in actuality directed the work of the government. Though not spelled out, this was a natural consequence of the fact that the Soviets were controlled by Bolsheviks, who were themselves required to follow their party. So while the constitution prescribed that these bodies be elected, as Bolshevik leader Adolf Joffe once put it, according to our unwritten constitution, all elections to Central Soviet and party institutions are actually conducted according to lists, compiled by the Central Committee of the Communist Party. So in general, the center created lists for the top offices, while passing off rough guidelines to lower party committees to make lists for their corresponding offices, specifying various quotas or goals for representation. For example, in 1921, a party circular was issued adjusting the number of independents that ought to be elected to local executive committees from 1/4 to 1/3. So coming down the chain, the local party cells received directions on the types of people they ought to select for the Soviets, which were used to craft the candidate list, taking into account local negotiations and demands as well. Hence, with local party leaders under pressure to get the results as instructed, this incentivized the coercion, flubbing of the numbers, and so on that were so widespread in early elections. But regardless, coming up the chain, delegates did not exactly compete against each other, running campaigns for why they should be in the government and garnering votes. Instead, they were all presented a list, created by that level's party committee, which was most often simply approved unanimously. As for why, many upper-level governments were virtually identical or at least controlled by the party committees, so they were simply approving the list that they themselves had created. But also, recall that factionalism was prohibited, and party members were mandated to follow central directions, meaning it would be very hard to contest the list without running afoul of party law. Additionally, from the early 1920s on, every organ began to be dictated according to a classified nomenklatura. At the most basic, a nomenklatura is a list outlining which positions a body had responsibility for staffing. The thing is though, basically any position of note in the country, whether ostensibly elected or not, was based on a series of party nomenclatura. In other words, it was mandated that the party had to approve the appointment and/or removal of the most important government positions. It was mandated that provincial party committees had to appoint any remaining provincial positions, and so on. The party charter mandated that these party committees themselves be approved from the top, or at least the party aspired to as much. The idea being to allow the central leaders broad control over the commanding heights, while delegating to and cooperating with substate party leaders to maintain control on the ground, or as they put it, to ensure that the party exerts real leadership in all areas of administration without exception. What this means is that if the party didn't approve your ability to be elected for the higher position, per the nomenclatura, you couldn't be elected, and your name wasn't put on the spisak. But in any case, such delegation went all the way up the chain, until finally reaching the union-wide meeting, known as the Congress of Soviets. Though the exact pathways changed over time, and were subject to countless special cases. The thing to remember is that there were several different hierarchies of delegation to reach it. There were the urban and rural pyramids we've already mentioned, as well as delegates from various public organizations. Namely, the Communist Party and its departments had the right to send ex officio delegates to the Congress, irrespective of elections. Interestingly, one of those departments was the incumbent CEC, so depending on how you look at it, the CEC elected people to itself. Or more simply, from this and the other departments, the Bolsheviks essentially got some 200 extra unelected seats for their top leaders. This means, in contrast to later systems, where even Stalin himself was technically some constituency's delegate, under the Lenin system, the most famous names didn't have a home district. They were sent to the Congress without standing for election, by virtue of the positions they already held. In any case, the Congresses were attended by as many as 2,500 people in this era, including candidate members. Speaking of which, we'll see this distinction between full and candidate members in many Soviet bodies. The difference is that full members had the right to vote, whereas candidate members could voice opinions, but were not officially counted. They also were there to fill vacancies if any appeared, in the order in which they were listed. This tradition possibly grew out of the underground days, when backup delegates used to be sent to party meetings in case some were arrested along the way. With the Soviet Congresses becoming big publicized events, they began to include many invited guests and dignitaries from around the world who were counted as candidates. And if it's any consolation, the appointed ex officio seats were technically candidates too, though that didn't stop them from leading the Congresses and from being elected to the higher bodies, obviously. Upon arrival, Congress-goers were first scrutinized by a credentials commission established by the incumbent leadership, which could change one's delegate status, or even bar entry altogether, meaning occasionally delegates were elected to the Congress, yet were thrown out anyway, namely during the era of the multi-party Congresses. Now, the Congress is often mistaken for a permanent deliberative legislative body, like the US Congress, for example, but this isn't the case. Again, something lost in translation is that sieste can have a connotation of more of a convention or sessional meeting, and this is the context in which the term was usually employed for over a century prior. As my trusty Soviet dictionary defines it, the action of the verb to meet, come together, or gather, as in a large gathering of guests, and then an assembly of representatives of a large public organization. But more importantly, the Congress was an impermanent, transient body. Constitutionally, it was supposed to occur at least once a year, after each annual election, or as called by the government. But as we saw, some years the elections were cancelled, postponed, or redone, so in actuality it was more like every 2 years. And either way, each convocation lasted only a couple days each. Last, the Congress wasn't singled out as a legislature, nor did it really act as one, in the sense of a body of lawmakers who propose, draft, discuss, and vote on their own laws themselves, as the minutes of the Congresses attest. In Soviet constitutional law, the Congress was officially the supreme power of the state, as a result of the theoretical continuity between the Soviets and the Congress. Now, within the exercise of supreme power, the Congress could give its stamp of approval to key reports, decrees, or laws as well. For example, the Constitution itself was put before the Congress. But passing laws was not the primary function of the Congress, nor where the vast majority of laws were passed. By one count, out of the 2,514 resolutions from 1917 to 21, the Congress passed 34 of them. So for all intents and purposes, I think calling it the Legislative Assembly would harm more than help. By the way, there were no additional rules regarding the modification of the Constitution. The CEC was granted the right to freely change or cancel provisions, as long as the changes were brought before the next Congress of Soviets. So in practice, the Constitution ended up being amended pretty frequently. But to get back to the point, the Congress was primarily a ceremonial body, whose function was to transmit the consent of the Soviets across the country for the government organs. In this sense, the Congress has sometimes been analogized to the Zemsky Sobor of the olden days. a consultative meeting granting legitimacy to policy rather than drafting it itself. Additionally, the Congress was a forum for prominent figures to give speeches and reports, which served the function of communicating the general direction of the state. Select figures might be invited to speak or voice concerns, but after that they disbanded and went home, entrusting the job of governance to the CEC. For this, each Congress was preceded by a party meeting, which discussed and set up the Congress's agenda, and by a commission under the incumbent CEC to create the list for the new CEC. This list was then read out to the Congress goers and affirmed unanimously by way of applause. In the minutes of the Second Union Congress, for example, we read, "Are there any who wish to speak on the list? No? Permission to vote. Who is in favor of accepting the list as a whole? Adopted." So as before, the election of the CEC shouldn't be misconstrued as delegates of the Congress putting forth their names and competing against each other for votes, as even more so than the lower levels, the roster of the CEC was determined beforehand and presented in full, only being subject to a kind of ceremonial pass-fail vote. Every CEC was created this way, and passed unanimously basically without discussion, or even the need for a strict count. That brings us to the CEC. By the time of the Lenin Constitution, it was supposed to hold a session at least 3 times a year, although in practice it met 24 times, so once or twice a year, and each session was anywhere from 1 to a dozen days long. In total, the CEC was in session for 147 days in 15 years. Just to give you some perspective, the US House and Senate each meet about that many days in a single year. As already discussed, this was a consequence of the diminishing role of the CEC in government. But there was also one final nail in the coffin, a 1919 party resolution to shift the CEC into a consultative body of visiting provincial leaders, such that they could still gain political training and serve as a conduit for communication between Moscow and the provinces. Perhaps this played into Lenin's concept of everyday people still being local workers but also lawmakers, rather than politician being a separate job in of itself. But it clearly had the opposite effect. Either way, this meant the CEC could no longer hope to meet permanently, instead having to have meetings planned in advance a few times a year, like the Congresses. So in effect, the Congress was a large annual gathering from across the country, while the CEC was a biannual one. Looking at the composition of the bodies, this becomes even more clear. First, in terms of actual social status, the Congresses were attended overwhelmingly by employees, namely party and government officials. And in the CEC it elected, about half were leaders of provincial government bodies or party organizations across the country. Another quarter were top leaders and bureaucrats in Moscow. Then there were the heads of the trade unions, military commanders, and the remaining fifth consisted of minor influential people, like the directors of factory plants, as well as some average Joes. This dual mandate, in which deputies had one or more leadership roles while simultaneously having a seat on the CEC, meant they couldn't stick around in Moscow. They had jobs to do all across the country. As a result, though it had the theoretical right to, the CEC no longer acted as a forum for creating laws either. Rather, it essentially approved whatever laws were presented to it by other organs, unanimously and automatically, when it had its occasional gatherings. Later on, this was actually even streamlined by having all the laws put on a single list to be approved all at once, without opportunity for discussion on them individually. Again, Sovnarkom could pass laws at any time, but it often chose to have the most important laws at least approved by the CEC, especially as the Civil War came to a close. Reason being, the CEC was the visible head of the Soviets, perceived as more representative and less tarnished by the arbitrary measures of the Civil War. And so as part of the process of reviving socialist legality and repairing the government's reputation, it increasingly involved the CEC, at least nominally, as a way of legitimizing the regime in the eyes of the public. But with the CEC no longer meeting regularly, it itself was given a list to approve for another body called the Presidium. Typically in an assembly format, there's one person who presides over the body, called the President. In pre- and post-revolutionary Russia, the president role began to commonly be distributed amongst multiple people, and thus became a Presidium. At first, the CEC had such a Presidium, as did most other assemblies, with no special powers constitutionally articulated. But at about the same time the CEC was demoted, its Presidium was expanded into a formal assembly in of itself, empowered to act on behalf of the CEC. So conceptually, the Presidium was like a collective president of the CEC, while also a body with a president of its own. More specifically, under the Lenin Constitution, the CEC technically consisted of two wings, a Union Council and a Council of Nationalities. There is not really much meaningful difference between them, both being appointed by the list as we said before, but each of these wings had its own Presidium, consisting of 7 people, and these 14, plus an additional 7 approved by joint session, made up the Presidium of the CEC as a whole. The Presidium then had a secretary who saw to its procedures, and a chairman, sometimes informally known as the Soviet president, given he acted in the manner of a typical figurehead of state. With the creation of the USSR, they were joined by one chairman per Soviet republic, though the Russian chairman, Lenin, remained informally the most prominent, portrayed as the country's affable starosta. So in the end, it was actually the Presidium which sat for any extended period of time, though even then not all of them, as most meetings were usually just attended by a handful of top people. Acting in the name of the CEC, they had the theoretical right to pass or cancel laws, and moderate disputes between offices, though they didn't have an independent role in doing so. Leading Bolshevik Nikolai Kristinsky described the functions more like this. When the party, in the course of controlling and directing the work of the state, desired the CEC to put its name to something, but the CEC wasn't available, they'd have the Presidium do it. If the party decided to revoke a law, they'd have the Presidium do it. That was the true function, not for it to create its own laws. And he pointed out they should be reprimanded if and when anyone attempted to act outside these bounds. Now within those bounds, as can be gathered from the minutes in the archives, there could be deliberation within the Presidium. Remembering, of course, they were all generally of the same mind as leading Bolsheviks, acting under the direction of their party, meaning the Presidium was never exactly adversarial. As a second responsibility, the Presidium was the manager of the over 100 internal departments and commissions formerly created under the CEC. And last, the Presidium had the job of developing beforehand the materials for upcoming Congresses of Soviets and CEC sessions. So as you may have noticed, while ostensibly the CEC elected the Presidium, the incumbent Presidium selected who was on the CEC. Plus, by virtue of being on the Presidium, they were automatically placed onto the next CEC, and were some of the only non-transient members. Meaning if we look at what's happening here from the top down, it's basically this. The Presidium was relatively fixed from year to year, only momentarily being joined by CEC members from across the country. Meanwhile, another task of the CEC was to approve the Council of People's Commissars, or Sovnarkom, though this too was more ceremonial than actual, as they were presented the list by the Sovnarkom chairman, which they always approved without fail. And as established early on, the chairman could make unilateral appointments without CEC confirmation anyway. As early as March 1918, the minutes suggest approval was already recognized as just formality, as they approved without discussion the people already chosen by Sovnarkom and serving in office. By the time of the first constitution, which merely states the CEC shall form Sovnarkom, giving no procedure for what that meant, Sovnarkom interpreted this as it having free rein to make changes to its composition without approval. But whether approved or not, Sovnarkom was the main ancillary body, and the body standing above the People's Commissariats. Commissariats can be thought of somewhat like government ministries or a cabinet, although again the Bolsheviks disfavored such a comparison. The name itself was intended to emphasize that this was a new, non-ministerial style of governance, though like it or not, they were forced to inherit much of the same infrastructure, personnel, and work of the pre-revolutionary ministries. At the top, each commissariat was formally governed by a collegium, whose chairperson, known as the People's Commissar, then also sat on Sovnarkom. They represented their commissariat there, but also just as much represented Sovnarkom in their commissariats, being the general go-between. The rest of the Collegium might include deputy commissars, department heads, elected representatives from relevant mass organizations and unions, or specialty experts. The composition was up to the discretion of the commissariat at first, the constitution stating only that Sovnarkom approved the choice they made. As for how the Collegium was to govern, implementation varied, but ideally decisions were supposed to be made collectively. The commissar was tasked with chairing the sessions and ensuring they ran effectively. He or she had the personal right to take decisions on all matters, if they had to, but this was evidently intended as a failsafe against gridlock, rather than to be the norm. And the Collegium also had the right to appeal to Sovnarkom or the Presidium if they disagreed with any decisions made by the commissar. At the start, there were 13 such commissariats, though others were added or changed later on, with some 51 men and 1 woman serving in Lenin's government as people's commissars over the course of 6 years. In addition to them, Sovnarkom also had its own chairman, an administrator who performed a secretarial role, and however many deputies or vice-chairmen so declared. Although such a name might suggest the vice-chairman was second to the chairman, there were actually multiple at once, and they didn't exclusively sub in for the chairman anyway, so they could arguably be treated as ministers without portfolio. That said, meetings were almost never attended by all the commissars. Instead, they came and went depending on the issue discussed. Only the chairman, Lenin, was a permanent fixture at every meeting. On the other hand, meetings were often open to additional people as requested, which will be a reoccurring theme with most government bodies. So while the first constitution provided for 18 commissars, attendance at any given meeting actually ranged from 26 to 34 people, as the commissars might be joined by their deputies, invited experts, or other government reps. Sverdlov, for example, despite never being an actual people's commissar, attended meetings frequently and even chaired a few. And with the Civil War taking commissars away from Moscow, meetings increasingly were attended by deputies and department proxies instead of the actual heads. But nonetheless, in the early months, Sovnarkom was a truly active body, the nexus of government, meeting nearly every day, sometimes twice a day, and overseeing virtually any and every issue in the country. They worked out decisions and took majority votes as needed. Who exactly had the right to vote on any given topic seems to have been slightly flexible, but once passed, Lenin signed the decree and it was issued with the force of law. Soon, with Sovnarkom taking on more and more responsibility, it developed a habit of creating offshoots. In late 1917, this began with Little Sovnarkom, a kind of think tank that Sovnarkom could outsource some of its administrative second-order work to. Nicknamed by Lenin his chief assistant, Little Sovnarkom would prepare bills, especially on jobs given to it by Lenin, which were then handed back to him to sign into law. Eventually, it became the first stop for all laws, its decision final until challenged. So what this means is that quite a lot of legislation issued in Sovnarkom's name was actually drafted by Little Sovnarkom and then issued by Lenin unilaterally, rather than ever actually being voted upon by Sovnarkom itself. Though evidently he was mindful about forwarding controversial and major proposals to the wider group where necessary. A third body, the Defense Council, was formed in late 1918 to oversee wartime logistics, though it continued to operate for long after the war. The Defense Council wasn't constitutionally delineated, leaving its exact powers largely undefined, but in essence, it was a streamlined Sovnarkom, composed of a few of its key members, and having de facto control over many of the commissariats. It too issued decrees with the same force of law, without requiring any additional approval from Sovnarkom. Virtually every meeting of either body was chaired by Lenin, but on the off chance he couldn't, Sverdlov, Trotsky, Stalin, Rykov, and the elder statesman Alexander Tsarupa all filled in at least once. They eventually settled into a more regular schedule, and with Lenin spearheading, both bodies gradually formalized, with strict rules of procedure and conduct. No smoking or chatter was allowed, latecomers were fined, all points had to be on the agenda. As the historian Sheila Fitzpatrick put it, he wanted a real government, not some kind of improvised directorate. Draft decisions were supposed to be worked out beforehand, collecting comments from all relevant commissariats before they could be put on the agenda. And for this, another influential body emerged, the Sovnarkom Administrative Department, Lenin's team of about 100 secretaries, clerks, and couriers who saw to all the paperwork behind the scenes, and headed by Administrator Vladimir Bonch-Bruyevich, who can be thought of sort of like a chief of staff. Other key figures include Lenin's personal secretary, Lydia Fotiva, Nadezhda Aliloyeva, Stalin's wife, and 25-year-old chemistry student turned administrator, Nikolai Gorbunov, who once literally carried the entire state budget in a briefcase to the Smolny Institute and stashed it in a wardrobe. It was the admin department which ensured the necessary interdepartmental consultations had actually taken place, and that proper documentation was received before a matter could be passed to Sovnarkom, and also checked to ensure decisions were actually followed, meaning in practice it was fairly influential in controlling the docket. The secretaries took the minutes of each Sovnarkom meeting, which were presented to Lenin personally the next morning at 10 a.m. sharp, to be checked and redacted before being sent off and distributed amongst the commissariats. But more than that, the admin department grew to include dozens of offices in the Kremlin, the mailroom, accounting, telegraphs and switchboards, the press and newsroom, the hospital and pharmacy, the canteen, and the garage with a fleet of rapid response motorcycles. From a combination of growing experience and rule set, Sovnarkom became better attuned under Lenin, but also became consumed by a rising amount of work. Commissars were expected to read on average 50 pages of pre-prepared documents before every meeting, on some days over 200. And additionally, Sovnarkom frequently created ad hoc commissions, usually from a handful of commissars and others, to see to a specific task. Dozens of these would come and go as needed, each with their own missions and procedures, and their own paperwork. Actually, even little Sovnarkom created sub-commissions. Some of these developed into permanent state bodies, like the State Planning Commission, or Gosplan, but most were supposed to be transitory. And by 1922, this had grown into a bit of a mess. It was noted there were 120 such commissions out there, and many were redundant, had no clear purview or goals, or hadn't even started their task. And that's not even including the CEC's 100-odd commissions. At one point, there was even a commission on the simplification of the Soviet apparatus. So to summarize, in the early years it was Sovnarkom as the overall nexus of government, backed up by Little Sovnarkom and a growing number of other miscellaneous commissions, the Defense Council, focusing on wartime affairs and later the economy in general, and the Administrative Department, keeping all of them running. It was this arrangement which carried the Soviets through the Civil War, while the CEC and the Soviet hierarchy were deprioritized. But wait, there's more. Also in the subordinate branch, Sovnarkom established a Supreme Council of National Economy, an administrative body seeing to overall economic issues and controlling the nationalized industries. The Supreme Council was essentially an extra-large People's Commissariat, which confusingly coexisted with the actual People's Commissariats for finance, trade, and labor. In practice, though, it came to focus on big-picture heavy industry, and in fact later on it was reformed into a number of People's Commissariats of Industry, but for now it was a special entity. And again, this isn't to be confused with the Defense Council, which also coordinated the economy, or Gosplan, which saw to national economic targets and objectives, or any of the other myriad of economic commissions and bodies. Moving outside the economy now, the Lenin Constitution carved out the Joint State Political Directorate, or OGPU, aka the Secret Police, as a kind of independent agency, whose chairman was invited to attend Sovnarkom meetings and was basically equivalent to a People's Commissar. Next, you may have noticed there's been no talk of a judiciary thus far, and that's because there was no independent judicial branch. Rather, the Supreme Court, which actually wasn't mentioned in the first constitution at all, was formally created by decree in late 1922 under the CEC's jurisdiction. While it could review cases questioning union laws, it submitted its opinion to the Presidium for it to act on, rather than having the power to overturn laws itself. and conversely the Presidium could cancel judicial acts of the Supreme Court, which is why, in the words of its chairman Vinokurov, the court was better regarded as a legal consultant, as the functions of a constitutional court belong entirely to the Presidium. Sitting on the court was a chairman, vice chairman, 4 additional judges, the chairman of each of the Republican Supreme Courts, and a representative of the OGPU, though not every case was actually considered by this full plenum. Rather, depending on the case, the court created various collegia and special commissions, which could consist of justices and non-justices, to take up the specific issue. There was the configuration of the Supreme Two, for example, in which many cases were actually decided by the chairman plus the Soviet prosecutor. The prosecutor was another office appointed by the Presidium, tasked with supervising compliance with laws, initiating judicial reviews, and directing state investigations. And neither the Supreme Court nor the prosecutor's office are to be confused with the People's Commissariat for Justice, which supervised both, or after 1926, the 3-man Politburo Commission on Judicial Affairs, which in actuality controlled all 3 of them, but more on that in a bit. So, did the Soviet government resemble the one which Lenin had envisioned back in State and Revolution? To answer that, let's talk about a lesser known, but perhaps just as important work, written about a year after, which in many ways is a direct complement to the former: The Immediate Tasks of Soviet Power. As we talked about in a previous video, this work was part of a shift in Lenin's thinking around the spring of 1918, whereby the difficulties and realities of Soviet power forced him to reverse, or at least delay, much of what was described in State and Revolution, to retreat from the principles of the Paris Commune. Perhaps the main problem innate to State and Revolution was the assumption that bureaucracy would become smaller and simplified. As practical experience showed, and Lenin eventually conceded, it became larger and more complex, though he still mainly attributed this to a consequence of Russia's economic backwardness. Either way, there was a gradual walking back of the immediacy of every cook and housekeeper running the state, from being ready, or near ready with training, to needing a lot of training over a painful extended period. But discussion on that will have to wait for another video. For now, let's look at the fate of Lenin's handful of initial prescriptions. As it turns out, one of Sovnarkom's first decrees was capping government salaries, including its own, and Lenin even issued a reprimand when an attempt was made to raise his. Similarly, the salaries of commissars and the rest of their collegia were equalized, to indicate no one was superior to any of their peers. Although plans were initially to equalize the pay of all government employees, a wage scale system was introduced instead with several different ranks of pay, though all were initially fairly modest. But with a paucity of qualified officials, in immediate tasks, Lenin now called for the enlistment of bourgeois experts by means of extremely high salaries. By 1919, they could expect to be paid over 6 times that of a skilled worker, or even Sovnarkom itself. The salary caps in general, on bureaucrats and party members both, would grow considerably later on, and not to mention, party members were increasingly rewarded with non-monetary privileges, like better housing, rations, vacations, and so on. As for the idea of radically opening up the administration through election of officials, collegiality, and so on, no legislation or standardization of collegiality was ever created under Lenin, meaning to what extent it existed and how it operated varied by department. But the evidence suggests it was implemented and taken pretty seriously at first. It wasn't uncommon for there to be internal debate in the collegia and for the appeal process to be exercised. This was perhaps most successful in places like the admin department. Unlike the commissariats, which tended to inherit czarist mechanisms and personnel, the admin department was a novel creation without pre-revolutionary precedent and prided itself on its uniquely Bolshevik workplace culture. The archives preserve a particularly interesting story in this regard. As a result of Bonch-Brievich apparently acting increasingly dictatorial, deciding on hirings and firings unilaterally, for example, some of the other employees formed a collective which petitioned over the issue, seemingly contributing to his retiring. In other words, the Kremlin employees unionized. This collective later developed into a formal party cell within the department. Such bottom-up staff activism was emblematic of a desire to partify the government across the board. Another interesting case was in the Commissariat for Labor. In 1918, it was led by a collegium of Alexander Shliapnikov, his deputy Viktor Nagin, and 11 others, though with Shliapnikov absent for much of the summer, it was the rest of the group ruling without him. During that time, in an effort to combat potential nepotism, the Collegium drafted a law barring relatives of officials from working in the same department, which was sent to Sovnarkom and passed. They then proceeded to look into their own commissariat, noting that several people would now have to be fired. But when Shliapnikov returned to work a month later, he evidently ignored the rule and rehired several of the fired people, when pressed, claiming he had consent to do so from the Presidium. This sparked a major legal dispute between Shliapnikov and the rest, led by Nagin, over the exact powers of collegiality and who could override who, completely derailing their work. Coincidentally, this also broke out around the time of Lenin's assassination attempt, meaning it was a test of how the system would work in his absence. Appealing to Sovnarkom, Nagin discovered there may have been informal consent from the Presidium, but no actual approval from Sverdlov. Moreover, Nagin argued, citing something he had heard from Lenin, the Presidium would be acting unlawfully if it did approve it. Evidently, Sovnarkom didn't make a ruling. But soon after, the party Central Committee decided to replace Shliapnikov with Vasily Smit, one of the dissenters, and to remove Shliapnikov and Nagin both from the commissariat. Officially, the resolution of the CC, as penned by Sverdlov, ruled that Shliapnikov acted inappropriately, but that the Collegium did as well. Sovnarkom then later confirmed the CC's appointment of Smit. Interestingly though, Nagin was present at the CC and Sovnarkom meetings that decided this, and though removed from the commissariat, he received a new job in the Supreme Council, continuing to participate in Sovnarkom after. Plus, it was one of the other leading dissenters who ended up being promoted. Shliapnikov, meanwhile, while not explicitly condemned, was sent off to the front. So what can we take away from all this? First, the incident demonstrates there was an internal political culture of collegiality in the commissariats. It was often ill-defined and not exactly written in law, but there was an expectation, which Sovnarkom kept maintaining. The resolution diplomatically criticized both sides, Nagin for disrupting the commissariat over the matter, but the fact that one side was demoted while another promoted implies the party was a little more sympathetic to one side over the other. Second, the situation demonstrates major constitutional confusion. There existed no regulations to appeal to, other than one vaguely written article of the Constitution, which both sides contested the meaning of. There were no formal legal proceedings either. The idea of a Supreme Court, which you might expect to be useful here, was completely irrelevant. Instead, the sides appealed to the authority of the CEC and Sovnarkom, and the unclear relationship between them. Shliapnikov arguing that the CEC had overridden the law, Nagin arguing that they couldn't even if they wanted to, appealing to some hearsay from Lenin as authoritative. But could they? Who knows? Perhaps most importantly though, what this incident demonstrates is the rising influence of the party as the final say. In actuality, the matter wasn't solved by either the CEC or Sovnarkom, or any government procedure. It was settled by the party leaders, discussing behind the scenes what to do with their members, and then intervening in the functioning of the state offices. Now, while collegiality was the norm at first, it also fell into decline, as the principle increasingly came into conflict with the desire for efficiency and concise decision-making. To get back to immediate tasks, here Lenin began to promote so-called dictatorial management, dictators with unlimited powers, unquestioningly obeying the will of the Soviet leader, of the dictator, arguing that in the interest of discipline and current practicality, the workers may need to acquiesce to unelected dictators in the workplace, even bourgeois ones, where necessary. The Railroad Decree of March 1918 being one early example, which effectively enshrined unilateral decision-making in matters of transportation. Similar decrees followed, reducing and simplifying collegia in general over the next year. This became the root of one of the major factional debates of the era, but to make a long story short, Lenin, initially in the minority, argued that collegiality had been important in the initial stages of the revolution, but was no longer suited for the current stage, and this position was officially adopted. By the time of the Lenin Constitution, collegia were relegated to collective advisory boards under the control of the commissars. Unlike in the 1918 Constitution, where collegia were elected from below, all members were now appointed from above by Sovnarkom. So in the end, while collegia continued to exist, collegiality itself fell to the wayside. It encountered firsthand the age-old balancing act that democraticity can come at the expense of efficiency, and vice versa. Although, while the Civil War and the need for efficiency marked the beginning of the end, collegiality also was proving problematic regardless. As can be gathered from the Shliapnikov Incident and other similar disputes, it allowed for factional disagreement and the advancement of divergent interests within the commissariats, potentially contrary to the will of the leadership, who were forced to defend their positions when under scrutiny. In other words, despite the assumption of a general will, personal differences of opinion, interest groups, and sectional divisions indeed manifested. As a final development, Lenin began to refer here, both in text and in action, to this need to separate two categories of democratic functions, the public discussion on the one hand, and the executive functions on the other, to separate the checking of the decisions from the execution itself, as to not impede the latter. As you may recall though, the very idea had been to eliminate this separation between rulers and ruled, to not relegate activity to just the periodic election of deputies or approval of laws. Thus, this was implicitly the last of the commune principles walked back. What makes immediate tasks that complement the state and revolution is how it elucidates two different systems for two different times and places. In the immediate future, in the absence of a sufficiently advanced and numerous proletariat, rather than administer themselves, they would have to fall back on the party to act increasingly on their behalf. So now let's finally look at how that party worked. Keep in mind, the party and party offices were a completely different sphere than the state offices. The electoral system we talked about before, that was only for the state. The party was a private organization with its own rules and procedures. Though on the other hand, the line between the two spheres was heavily blurred. As Stalin once remarked, the party and the Soviet are intertwined, inseparable from each other. To begin, the Communist Party didn't have open membership, meaning one could not simply join at will. Assuming the party was accepting new members, and you had letters of recommendation from two existing members, in addition to an acceptable resume, you had to apply and be approved by the local party officials, ideally after working to demonstrate your commitment to the party and its principles for a significant length of time, and after paying your dues both monetarily and through activity. Meaning, depending on the time and place, joining the party could be a decade-long endeavor, which required one impress or appease their local party branch, and not deviate from party positions, lest one risk being purged. But for our purposes here, the important thing is just that party membership was usually difficult to obtain, and quite rare. The number of citizens who were party members was always a very small percentage. During Lenin's tenure, there were about 400,000 to 800,000 full members, or in other words, a fraction of 1% of the total Soviet population. These members worked in a vast network of party cells, which catered to all public organizations. So for example, at a university, there would be a school Soviet, but also a school cell. Factories would have a factory Soviet and a factory cell. The former was the state office, and the latter the party office. Likewise, in the major government bodies, with 3 or more Bolsheviks, they were supposed to organize a party cell, caucus, or fraction within the body. So the CEC was a state body containing Bolsheviks plus some independents or minor parties, and the Bolshevik fraction of the CEC was treated like a party cell. The cells did managerial work, like collecting dues, approving new recruits, held activities for party members, and led propaganda and agitation to the locals. Most importantly, the cell was the party's liaison to the constituency, actualizing on the local level the plans from above, including those which pertain to the Soviets. The party charter put it like this: the Communist Party sets itself the task of winning decisive influence and complete leadership in all workers' organizations. It especially strives to implement its program and its complete dominance in the present state organizations, such as the Soviets. Thus, we see an entire parallel hierarchy of party cells and committees, in addition to supplementing and initially funded by the state hierarchy. And this hierarchy worked in a similar manner. Local committees sent delegates to a conference which approved the next higher committee, and so on. By 1928, there were about 3,500 committees in the country, with 50,000 members combined. Each committee was then led by a smaller body called either a bureau or a presidium, which increasingly was the actual ruling executive, and led by a chairperson known as the secretary. This was the leading figure of the party branch, who along with 4 other key leaders was known informally as the Petorki, the 5 chiefs of the level, all of which appointed from the top via the central nomenklatura. The party charter required that all lower committees be confirmed by higher committees, which in general occurred before the elections were held, meaning the people to be elected at the lower levels were pre-checked and often recommended by those at the upper levels. Typically, the list was created by the incumbent secretary, though through consultation within the local apparatus. So the district and provincial secretaries create the list for who will be elected to the district committee and give it to the district conference. Then all the districts were required to write up a list of people for the province to review, so that they could approve who was sent to the provincial conference and create a list for the provincial committee. All these lists were then approved by open votes at the conferences, at least until 1939, that is, when secret ballots were introduced. From then on, the way it worked is the initial list was presented, then attendees had the right to discuss, question, or dispute any candidate on it. An open vote was taken first regarding if the disputed candidate should remain on the list or not. Then they proceeded to the secret vote by ballot, in which attendees were given a copy of the list and could cross out or add names to it. In general, few candidates were removed in the first vote, but it was nonetheless an opportunity to scrutinize the candidates in a town hall style format. Fewer still, if any, failed the second vote, though the number of crossouts could still be informative. The procedure is thus an indication of how party discipline was conceptualized. A public consensus was to be worked out regarding the candidates. If the whole group disapproved a candidate, he or she could fail. But then once the list was arrived at, it was expected of them to approve it. Again though, in the 20s and 30s, the conferences didn't have the secret vote component at all. Instead, to give you an idea of how it worked, let's look at the transcript of a typical party election from Leningrad Oblast in 1930. Let's pass to the next item on the agenda, the election of the regional committee. Comrades, the new membership of the regional committee, as put forward by the Conference of Bureaus of Delegates, consists of 179 members and 46 candidates. Has anyone any objections to adopting a regional committee of 179 members and 46 candidates? No. Adopted. Alright, so on the list we have Ivan and Alek. Comrades, does anyone challenge any of these nominations? No. How are we to vote on them? Individually or as a whole? As a whole. Right, I put the list to a vote as a whole. And adopted unanimously. After the committee was elected, it would hold its first meeting, attended by representatives of the central leadership in the case of all upper-level ones, where the bureau, the secretary, and the other heads were approved, and this part was always done throughout by open vote. In some rare cases, party conferences became a site of open confrontation between groups, not really over ideological differences, but petty squabbles and institutional battles between local chiefs and cliques over key positions. But again, considering the rules against factionalism, and that the secretaries had the primary say, they could harass or expel opponents on the grounds of them undermining the party's authority, making it hard for any formal opposition to really go anywhere. And regardless, the central leadership could also change the composition after an election, transfer people around, or even close a branch entirely. As after all, this was a political party. The functionaries were elected, but also employees, so to speak. So in the end, rather than rising up the chain through a series of elections in one location, many, if not most, secretaries were actually appointed there between elections from some other branch of the party, then confirmed at the next election. Then, every so often, the party would call a convention or party congress. This could be sort of analogized to the DNC or RNC in the United States, though without an open primary beforehand, in that it's a private meeting of members of a political party or their associates who have been invited, selected, or elected to attend. The party congresses were, like the state elections, mostly unstandardized, being held whenever so arranged and in whatever manner decided by the party leadership. As such, during this era, there was usually one every year, although they grew further apart over time, at one point being put on hold for 13 years. And they were attended by however many delegates were selected and able to attend, usually 1 to 2,000. Also, like the Congresses of Soviets, the Party Congress functioned as a highly publicized, symbolic event, serving to announce shifts in policy and the current mood among the leaders, and to mobilize support for coming projects. Even more so actually, given it was here that the policy of the ruling party would be formalized prior to the Congresses of Soviets. This was also a crucial site of communication, albeit imperfect, between center and periphery, and it was a formative educative event for Bolshevik members, many of whom would have never visited Moscow otherwise, complete with mass spectacles, parades, and special perks and privileges. Before the revolution, it had been at the party congresses where the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks once debated political strategy, slogans, and rules. For a time, they continued to serve as this close-knit forum for debating the party program and for face-offs between different factions. But, over the course of the early to mid-1920s, this dynamism basically ended. The main reason being, party congresses were at the discretion of the party leadership, who determined when they were held and broadly who were invited to them. To begin, the rules for assigning seats to the congresses were fluid, being determined by commission before each one. The only consistent guidelines being that more populous departments ought to have more delegates, and that there ought to be around one voting delegate for every 1,000 members within the party, though even this was pretty rough. The attendance list could contain all kinds of delegates, from city and provincial conferences, departments, fractions, and so on, with less than proportional representation. And top leaders could be grandfathered in without election, superdelegates if you will. If we take the 8th Congress as an early example, Lenin and Stalin were both superdelegates. Then you have one delegate from an 87-man local section, while another represents several thousand. Later on, the main leaders tended to be elected at the Moscow Conference, or by some other conference in absentia. But again, the delegates were not chosen by the public in elections whatsoever, as these were party congresses, not state ones. Rather, the way it worked is that the central leadership scheduled a congress about 2 to 3 months out and issued instructions to the incumbent provincial party leaders to hold provincial conferences. These might be attended by members of the provincial committee, the secretaries of key districts, and various elder statesmen so invited. Based on the instructions received, the provincials created lists, which were then announced at the conferences for approval. Conference attendees could propose alternative delegates, but much like the elections we talked about before, alternatives were in a really disadvantaged position, and so rarely ever succeeded over the official nominees. Either way, each department or province selected their delegates, and then delegates were grouped into various regional delegations upon arriving at the Congress. Combined with this, any sort of oppositional campaigning was heavily curtailed, then eventually prohibited outright, not least of which because of the formal ban on factions, meaning one could not openly organize a challenge to party leadership before the Congress. Yet the incumbent majority could campaign, with the full brunt of the party apparatus. Mainly this was done via the instructing and monitoring of those provincial conferences, by the dispatching of central leaders to whip up support, and through mass anti-opposition pressure campaigns. And as a last resort, each Congress also had a Credentials Commission, which too could bar people entry. So as we'll talk about in more detail another time, as Stalin and allies became increasingly dominant over party leadership, not only did Stalin have significant influence over the appointment of party officials, he influenced which of them were elected to the Congresses. This was a trend that had actually already begun under Lenin, but under Stalin it became much more advanced, ensuring his supporters always outnumbered his rivals, meaning Congresses were not necessarily a perfect representative cross-section of the countrywide party opinion. Lastly, consequential decision-making began to be taken out of the view of the Congress anyway. Though initially party members could propose issues to be raised, gradually from about 1923 on, the agenda became more tightly controlled and prearranged, with leadership approving all reports and questions in advance, and also issuing instructions to delegates on how to conduct themselves, all helping to put forward a public face of party unity and strength. Important discussions were often reserved for non-plenary or closed sessions, which is to say, they weren't held in front of the full Congress, but in special subcommissions or closed-door meetings for certain sections of the Assembly. And while the Congress formally approved various party organs, much like the state elections, from 1921 on, these selections were fully changed to election by prearranged list. The first body to elect was a Presidium, the group which would direct the proceedings of the Congress throughout its duration. In the early years, getting someone onto the Presidium was the first step for any dissident faction hoping to have a chance at relevance at the Congress. But eventually the norm became for the composition to be prearranged by the incumbent leadership, more or less eliminating that possibility. In addition to general management of the Congress, the Presidium was important as it appointed the various Congress subcommissions, created to discuss the major points on the agenda. Behind the scenes, the leadership already pre-discussed each topic, and so had instructions for these subcommissions, most of them led by and composed of said leadership anyway. But nonetheless, it was these subcommissions which held separate meetings and drafted Congress resolutions, which were then presented to the full Congress for approval. Second, from at least 1922 on, there was a semi-formal body called the Council of Elders. Taking inspiration from the Tsarist body of the same name, this was a special caucus of the top 10th senior-most members from each regional delegation. It held closed sessions to discuss contentious issues, and was presented with secret information that the full Congress wasn't privy to. For example, the infamous Testament of Lenin was actually revealed first to the elders, not a full Congress, and the individual delegations elected to not pursue the issue publicly. Thus, the Council of Elders was crucial for ensuring the public face of unity, as here the prearranged lists were finalized and negotiated, and decisions were pre-checked to ensure there was full consent of the delegations before going into the actual Congress. But the most important organ to elect was the Central Committee. This was the de jure collective leadership of the party between Congresses. Later on, it would undergo a significant bloatification and become unwieldy, much like the CEC, aided by the fact that membership in the CC increasingly became automatic for certain offices, rather than being based on an individual's personal merit or influence, in what's been nicknamed the job slot system. But in these early years, it was still only a few dozen people large. The list for the CC was drawn up beforehand, sometimes further refined in preliminary meetings with the elders. Usually it was created by an ad hoc commission consisting of a few incumbent CC members and invited leaders from the most important party contingents. For example, in 1919, the list for the incoming CC was written by Stalin and Kristinsky through discussion with key delegates, and this list was pre-approved at a meeting of the outgoing CC 3 days before the Congress was to vote on it. The early Congresses occasionally had alternative lists proposed, or negotiations on the list, involving some backroom wheeling and dealing. Requests were made but often rejected, though there are some rare instances of modifications being made to the official list. At the 13th Congress, for example, 2 women were added to the list at the request of the Department for Women Workers. But point is, it was still generally the old CC which selected who would be on the new CC. making it nigh impossible to build up a real challenge to incumbent leadership. One essentially had no chance of being elected unless on the pre-arranged list. This list was presented to the whole Congress for approval, and evidently, it occasionally was the case that some of those elected didn't even know they were going to be on the list. But unlike, say, the Congress of Soviets, where the names were simply read aloud and then there was a quick verbal confirmation, each party Congress goer received an actual copy of the list, on which they could cross out names, and optionally write in an alternative on a dotted line. Later in Soviet history, the list was essentially always approved unanimously. But as demonstrated in a previous video, in the first decade or two, people did cross out names. There's one example of a candidate being voted down like this during the period in question. At the 14th Congress, a candidate member, Nikolai Sevastyanov, was defeated, and a replacement was proposed on the spot, who was then elected by a show of hands. No write-in candidate, however, appears to have ever been successful. There were also some special exceptions. At the 13th Congress, after the vote was already over, Stalin asked that Alexander Tolokontsev be allowed in, and he was. But almost always, whoever was on the list was who was elected, and usually they all received 90% of the vote or higher. So keep in mind, it was never the case that, say, Stalin and Trotsky were alternative candidates running against each other, and Stalin received more votes than Trotsky, so the latter was defeated. No, there was only one list, and both were on it. Both always received high approval, until one day Trotsky just stopped appearing on the list. Next, in addition to the Central Committee, were various bureaus, commissions, and departments which ran the day-to-day affairs of the party. Not only were there party-specific bodies you might expect, like a propaganda department and a party newspaper, during and after the Civil War, the party grew immensely into a kind of state within a state, with departments for all manner of state functions, and employing some 42,000 people already by 1922. So take the bureaucracy so far described and double it. There were government ministries for, say, education, foreign affairs, finance, but also party departments for education, foreign affairs, and finance, which overlapped with and monitored the duties of the government offices. As we'll see in future videos, some of these departments even became influential quasi-governmental bodies in their own right, with unclear jurisdictions, creating a major source of confusion and conflict. One of these commissions worth highlighting is the Central Control Commission. This was a body tasked with monitoring the behavior of party members and rooting out any deviations. And of course, there was yet another parallel network of control commission bodies monitoring the party committees at every level. As you can imagine, the Control Commission was a powerful tool for regulating the range of acceptable opinion, as what counts as a so-called deviation is in the eye of the beholder. At the top level, the body was led by a Presidium, whose members were barred from simultaneously being members of other higher bodies, like the Central Committee or the Politburo. More on them in a moment. But they sat in on and advised Politburo meetings, the chairman of the CCC being basically equal in status to a Politburo member, and often becoming one. The two bodies could also form a joint session, which acted as the highest party court. Now, the period of time a little before and after the October Revolution could be called the golden age of the Central Committee, in that it actually met frequently and had real impactful debates, like the meeting regarding the seizure of power, for example, or the huge surge of controversy around the time of Brest-Litovsk. However, as decision-making concentrated more strongly in the state body of Sovnarkom, and with many members relocated or not taking part, the CC largely fell by the wayside, usually relegating itself to only party-related affairs, or occasionally allocation of forces questions, meaning which party members to put into what government offices. By late 1918 and 19, it was holding meetings maybe a couple times a month, attended by only 6 to 7 people on average, Sverdlov, Lenin, Stalin, Trotsky being the core group. Later, meetings fell off completely. But then, there was a major shift in early 1919. By then, it was becoming obvious there were some problems. You had a massively ballooning state and a massively ballooning party, and they had overlapping, unclear duties. Sovnarkom had become the nexus of decision-making, while the Central Committee was barely used in comparison. One logical conclusion at this point might have been to just let the party wither or even combine into the state, its task having been completed. But instead, a conscious effort was launched to revitalize and reform the party, to continue augmenting the duties of the government. And to ensure this direction, several new or expanded permanent party organs were launched, namely the Secretariat, the Organizational Bureau, and the Political Bureau, all of which theoretically of equal standing, and all to be elected at the first meeting of the new CC, though again by unanimous approval of a pre-arranged list. Though affirming the party was to direct the activities of the Soviets, not to replace them, as Molotov would later observe, in hindsight, this decision marked the point at which the party committee replaced the Soviet organs. Orgburo was to be a broad organ overseeing the organization of the party, supervising the work of local committees across the country, and having the power to place and replace party members in various positions. The Secretariat was originally just what it sounds like, the body in charge of secretarial work and technical coordination of meetings, reports, and communications, as well as administration of the party's internal departments. It grew out of an office of essentially just Sverdlov and a handful of secretaries into a major department employing nearly 1,000 people by the mid-20s. And after 1922, it gained an overall chairman called the General Secretary. Lastly, there was the Politburo. This had nominally existed on and off since August 1917, but it was only at this point that it was codified into the Politburo proper. At the start, this was a permanent committee with 5 full members, 7 by the time of Lenin's death. Formally responsible to the CC, it was intended as a body that could take decisions on questions that cannot wait. Later, as per the 11th Party Congress, its mission was clarified as general leadership and direction of all policies of the Soviet state. With such a mandate, the Politburo over time began to stand above the rest, the quantity and scope of its discussions increasing dramatically. Soon it was here, not Sovnarkom, that decision-making began to concentrate, directing, bypassing, or overruling government decisions. It was here that laws began to actually be written and passed, and here that the big-picture decisions were made on who was picked for which positions, its members often holding those positions themselves simultaneously. But if Sovnarkom was so dominant prior, why was it eclipsed by the Politburo? Mainly, the Politburo became more popular because it was a more flexible, informal body that was far more authoritative. As we saw, Sovnarkom was a rather large body for a wartime government, and it had all kinds of rules and procedures. It had paperwork that needed to be filled out and read and commented on. That was important to ensure fairness and accountability, but it also quite simply was a lot of work. The Politburo, meanwhile, could meet whenever and decide whatever. Another issue is that Sovnarkom began to be taken less seriously. From the beginning, there was a trend of the actual commissars missing meetings, some of which was understandable given Civil War conditions. But paradoxically, it was after the Civil War ended that attendance began to decline even faster, to an average of just 3 commissars per meeting by 1922. So conditions were improving, yet Sovnarkom was attended less. Arguably, it was the very collegial attitude the Bolsheviks sought to promote that shot themselves in the foot here. Sovnarkom wasn't treated as a true cabinet of strong individual ministers, and was never allowed to develop into one, because it was a collegium of collegia, where numerous people were constantly subbing in and out. The commissars, many of which having other matters to attend to, more and more delegated to their deputies, meaning Sovnarkom was increasingly attended in practice by second-rate people who were less able or less comfortable making final decisions. And so Sovnarkom became unable to decide much of anything. The Politburo had no such problem. It was a small, streamlined party group, and as we've established, the party de facto trumped the government. It could make final decisions. Not to mention, Sovnarkom had grown completely detached from the Soviet hierarchy. Remember, even the norm that the CEC was supposed to appoint them was allowed to erode pretty quickly. Thus, the commissars didn't operate with a strong sense of mandate from them, but rather by virtue of appointment by the party. and thus it was ultimately this alternative source of legitimacy from which they took authority. Which leads us to the final reason. Increasingly, the party became the court of final appeals. As we saw with the Shliapnikov example, it was the party which had the final say when there was a governmental dispute. And theoretically, any party member had the right to appeal to the party for guidance at any time, meaning if a commissar didn't like a law, rather than propose a new law or fight it constitutionally, you could just go to the party, which is to say go to the Politburo, and ask them to reconsider it. Archival records attest, such appeals grew steadily and enormously from the moment the Politburo was created. The rise in general is evidenced just from the fact that in 1918 and the first half of 19 combined, only 17 pages of paperwork were sent by the government to the CC, while in 1921, that number was 1,113. This was a worrying development for many in the party, including Lenin himself, and it was a fixation of all the major oppositionist groups of the era as well, though in general none ever really mounted much in the way of a long-term structural solution to the problem, except perhaps Valerian Osinski-Obolinski. Though of course rejecting bourgeois democracy like the rest of them, he proposed there could nonetheless be a kind of Soviet separation of powers, with strict delineation in the responsibilities of state and party. But this idea was denounced as constitutionalist. Not wavering on his rejection of the separation of powers, all Lenin could offer instead was for now a general platitude, that they should simply ought not to do this as much. After all, he argued the appealing to the Politburo had really only arisen because of his illness, though as records attest, the trend had actually begun far before Lenin's absence, and it showed no signs of stopping after. Basically every commissar appealed to the Politburo at least once, even Osinski funny enough. And most glaringly, so did Lenin, meaning him being absent didn't tell the whole story, even he couldn't resist. Let's compare a few cases, including a rare instance where Lenin was defeated. In 1920, through Little Sovnarkom, Lenin issued a law closing one of Moscow's theaters, to which Kamenev, as chairman of the Moscow Soviet, protested that this was an infringement upon local affairs. Perhaps attempting to head off an appeal to the Politburo, knowing that Kamenev was a member of that body too, Lenin advised him to appeal to Sovnarkom. Lenin, through Sovnarkom, was then able to craft the resolution such that the theater would remain closed, albeit adding that the Moscow Soviet would have a say in Little Sovnarkom on Moscow matters in the future. Given Politburo intervention was rare at the time, and because Kamenev evidently didn't care to press the issue, that settled that. 2 years later, in January 1922, there was a similar scuffle over theaters. This time it was Lunacharsky pushing through a resolution in Sovnarkom that the famous Bolshoi Theater should be preserved, which was supported unanimously. By all sans Lenin, that is. Begrudgingly accepting the decision there, Lenin went to the Politburo, of which he was a member and Lunacharsky wasn't, and had it order the Presidium to re-examine the law. Again, this shows it was the Politburo that could direct the government bodies, and it also shows how Sovnarkom and the Presidium were basically being used to play one parent against the other. But to Lenin's dismay, the Presidium agreed it would be economically inexpedient to close down the theater. So Lenin went back to the Politburo and ordered an audit of the theater to determine how much money they could be saving. Yet even still, the rest of the group wasn't persuaded for full closure, and so after about 2 months of this on and off, Lenin dropped the matter. There's a few things to note with this, the first being the relative level of restraint. While the Politburo could and would in the future be used to order laws be cancelled directly, at this stage, Lenin still preferred to have another body do it. There was an effort being made to use the legitimate channels. Indeed, Lenin would pass a law later that year, trying to at least standardize the complicated process of interdepartmental appealing. It also shows that while the Politburo could easily overturn a law they didn't like, they could also defend a popular one, even against Lenin. Granted, this was a minor issue rather than a hill to die on. Conversely, consider the example we saw in the Philosopher's Steamship video, which took place right after this. In that instance, Lenin took on a specific legislative project himself, personally writing a change to the criminal code in May, which was discussed in the Politburo, handed off to the GPU to finalize and implement, and then approved unanimously by the Presidium in June, before finally being made public in August. The accompanying reforms of the universities were drafted by the GPU Collegium, then approved and implemented at a meeting of the Politburo, meaning in that case you didn't have even the nominal vote by the government first. Another example, which will appear later in the historiography series, is the Purge of 24. Here the party created a plan for a purge of university students. The Politburo issued the command, though it was signed as a Sovnarkom resolution, and then the purge was implemented through party commissions. In other words, this was a state policy planned and implemented behind closed doors by the party, being directly ordered by the Politburo. Sovnarkom was nominally invoked, while the CEC had no role whatsoever. I bring up all these examples to say there were initially multiple ways in which Soviet laws came about, but overall, they all arose at the discretion of the party, and alongside a gradual rise of the Politburo in the process, from an arbiter to a director to the source of government policy. Whatever restraint there once was, it gradually deteriorated, not least of which when the main Sovnarkom patron became incapacitated, and without ordaining anyone specifically to take over for him. By that time, commissariats began increasingly sending questions not to Sovnarkom first, but to the Politburo, as it became commonplace to discuss questions there before the Sovnarkom meeting, where the pre-made decision would simply be confirmed into law. In 1922, they even decreed that Sovnarkom could only transfer a case or bill to the CEC after the party had ruled on it first, so that, quote, the CEC wouldn't have to change its decisions. Not only was this a tacit acknowledgement that the Politburo actually decided the laws, you can see how it arose naturally from the grave concern over bureaucracy waste and red tape. Better to submit an idea to the Politburo first, before anyone in the CEC wastes their time actually drafting the law. This state-party relations debate would later become wrapped up in the succession debate, with Trotsky coming to argue the Politburo should be curtailed, and unsurprisingly the Politburo majority not wanting to entertain that. The thing is, while Lenin could recognize the problem, his ability to solve it was limited by his commitment to the old Marxist ideal. He wanted to fix the ballooning of the party, but couldn't stomach any solution to bourgeois parliamentarian, or which threatened the Bolshevik monopoly, and so rejected any serious reform of the Politburo, at least until it was too late. Thus, any criticism against the Politburo after him could very easily be construed as contrary to Lenin's vision. But more on that another time. In all this, you may have noticed the system was built up pretty heavily around the personality of Lenin. Not only was he the dominant presence in all the bodies discussed, he was the common bridge between them, which would make for a pretty big problem when he suddenly became incapacitated. His government was fluid in both structure and norms, sometimes ad hoc, and on many occasions, he personally intervened to have things succeed or fail. People often came to him personally with bills, seeking his support before going to a group, knowing that he could get them to pass. Though the Soviet system formally made no such provision, Lenin was, in effect, the vozhd, the leader, the chief, not as a result of any office or title, but through his unassailable auctoritas as the very founder of the party. One Sovnarkom attendee described working with him like this. At that time, all the top-notchers of the Communist Party were undoubtedly one close-knit family. Lenin was not merely a chairman, but the recognized chief, to whom everyone brought his thorny problems. The commissars quarreled amongst themselves in their daily work, but here Lenin had the last word, and all alike left those meetings reassured, as though their quarrels had been those of children, now pacified by a wise parent. But on the other hand, this government also made a conscious effort to institutionalize. Lenin was a charismatic authority, but also a chief executive, activist, and finally, a politician. He played the game of politics considerably. There was a push and pull amongst the leadership, with Lenin compromising or giving ground some of the time, while fighting hard and forcing through decisions other times. In particular, Having control over Little Sovnarkom gave him an unrivaled amount of influence in controlling the actual formulation and execution of policy, and he was certainly not afraid to appeal and to escalate if he absolutely had to. Yet he seems to have preferred to concentrate things in Sovnarkom and to make an effort to use the government offices, where his de jure titles actually lay, unlike Stalin, whose approach was the opposite. There is, however, an inherent tension between these two poles. The appealing of decisions from one body to the next, of cutting corners and bypassing the rules, proved corrosive to the very institutional integrity and coherence Lenin desired. Legitimization of personalist authority, decoupled from these institutions, hampered the growth of institutional authoritativeness, while opening the door for further usurpation based on past precedent. By establishing that state bodies could be ignored or overruled arbitrarily, their potence as true structural checks against overreach in the future becomes fantasy, regardless of what the Constitution might promise. All the while, rather than lightening the load, this institutional incoherence produced heavy redundancy and increased work, as did the myriad of parallel hierarchies and local bodies, more than we even had time to discuss here, created unsystematically and often at odds with each other, as did the Russian nesting doll of ever-increasing bodies within bodies, much like in the Tsardom, emerging here from conflicting desires for greater participation but also greater efficiency. Meanwhile, Lenin's fatal contribution to the downfall of Sovnarkom would prove his inability to walk away from it, to accept that his illness meant a step back, to envision politics without himself, was not in his nature, which is why he never relinquished his post, and why he appointed various deputies to cover for him rather than any clear successor to replace him. With Sovnarkom's authority already slipping, and now no firm leadership within it, it stood no fighting chance. Thus resolved the contradiction of having not one, but two systems jerry-rigged together. On the one hand, the Bolsheviks inherited the Soviets, a hierarchy that essentially culminated in a multi-party workers' parliament, a parliament which theoretically composed a British-style cabinet, where legitimacy derived from the representative body and those who elected it from below. On the other hand, they inherited a czarist system, in which a more presidential-style cabinet derived its legitimacy by appointment from above, though replacing the czar for the party. With the atrophy of the Soviets as institutions, the result was that there was no foundation on which to legitimize Sovnarkom as the manifestation of the dictatorship of the proletariat. The experience and actions of the Civil War instead produced a party whose success, like the Tsar, was believed to come through its unassailable sovereignty. Government bodies became alternative instruments with which the sovereign could handle business, rather than bodies with mutual interest against the sovereign power. But if the party, and the Politburo more specifically, was now confirmed as the nexus of Soviet decision-making, how exactly did decision-making work within the Politburo? How did it govern the state? And how did the rise of Stalin change it all?